The July 20th plot of 1944 was a failed attempt to assassinate German dictator Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, and for the resistance group to take power by means of a plan called Operation Valkyrie. The resistance needed the army to stage a successful coup. It was through the army that direct access to Hitler could be obtained. It was also the army that had the power to successfully overthrow the Nazi government. Although many among the military leadership were loyal to Hitler, some officers were opposed to National Socialism. Army opposition to Hitler began during the early days of his rule. The fact that Hitler was Austrian, lower middle class, and had achieved only the rank of corporal during his military service was frowned upon by many officers. Army leaders were also suspicious of Hitler's SA troops, which they viewed as a threat to their own power. Hitler managed to alleviate some of these fears during the Night of the Long Knives, when he purged most of the SA leadership, thus guaranteeing his own control over SA troops. Most SA organizations were either disbanded or infused into the SS.
The SA posed a problem for Hitler. Ernst Röhm, the SA's leader, insisted on incorporating the German army into the SA's organizational framework. This distressed many of the army's leaders. Hitler, who needed the military to establish total control, realized the problem Röhm presented. Hitler needed Röhm out of the way in order to solidify his command and win the army's support. The army was in no way won over by Hitler immediately.
During the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler not only purged the SA, he also took the opportunity to murder other governmental, military and civilian opponents. Two such victims were General Schleicher and his assistant, General Ferdinand von Bredau. Thanks to a military cover-up in which Schleicher was implicated in a supposed attempted coup, many in the military turned a blind eye to the murders. Yet Hitler's actions were not forgotten by all. The Fritsch affair also created a degree of tension between Hitler and members of the military. General Fritsch, a well-respected general, was dismissed from his office under fraudulent allegations of homosexuality. Fritsch's continued outspokenness over Schleicher's and von Bredau's murders was a leading factor in his dismissal. Most of the other generals realized that the charges were the result of a setup and never forgot Hitler's intimidation techniques.
Schweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Ungarn, Rumänien, Jugoslawien.
If we are not destroyed, all these countries, ancient countries, many of them, will be rescued and restored. It may well be that the final extinction of a baleful domination will pave the way to a broader solidarity of all the men in all the land than we could ever have planned if we had not marched together through the fire.
deutscher Jugend, alljährlich begrüße ich mit euch anlässlich des Reichsparteitages die Millionenmasse aller unserer deutschen Jungen und Mädchen im ganzen Reich. Zeiten kommen und vergehen. Generationen wachsen oft heran, ohne dass es ihnen vergönnt ist, wirklich ein großes Schicksal zu erleben oder gar mitzugestalten. Unsere Generation hat die Vorsehung auserlesen, Großes an unserem Volk zu erleben und Größeres noch an ihm zu gestalten. Ihr seid nun die Zeugen geworden eines großen geschichtlichen Vorgangs, der sich oft in Jahrhunderten nicht wiederholt. Ihr seid selber in diesen Jahren Kämpfer gewesen für dieses neue, größere Deutschland. Unermesslich sind die Aufgaben, die uns gestellt sind. Wie immer sind wir nicht erzogen in den alten Generationen, sondern es wird erzogen immer und immer. Wenn nicht einmal die Vorsehung von meinem Volk wegnehmen wird, dann werde ich dem kommenden Führer ein Volk hinterlassen, das eisenfest zusammengefüllt und zusammengeschlossen ist. Dafür seid ihr mir alle, Junge und Junge, Mädchen und Mädchen, Garanten. Und der hat immer noch in deutschen Landen am besten gebaut, der vertraut auf das deutsche Volk. Und das seid ihr.
Despite existing tensions, Hitler's subsequent policies gained the support of many within the military. However, there were still those like General Ludwig Beck who were opposed to his aggressive war policy. Beck believed that Nazi militarism would eventually lead to Germany's ruin. Others, like Major General Henning von Tresckow, were appalled by the atrocities that occurred during the Reich's eastward expansion. Dissent also developed within the Abwehr, the military intelligence, and the foreign service. Eventually, dissenters began to seek one another out through a network of resistance cells.
In 1941, a new conspiratorial group formed. It was led by Colonel Henning von Tresckow, a member of his uncle, Field Marshal Fedder von Bock-Staff, who commanded Army Group Center in Operation Barbarossa. Tresckow systematically recruited oppositionalists to group staff, making it the nerve center of the army resistance. Little could be done against Hitler while his armies advanced triumphantly into the Western Soviet Union through 1941 and 1942. Even after the setback before Moscow in December 1941 that caused the dismissal of both Brauchitsch and Boch. During 1942, Oster and Trekow nevertheless succeeded in rebuilding an effective resistance network.
Their most important recruit was General Friedrich Albrecht, head of the General Army Office headquarters at the Bendler Block in central Berlin, who controlled an independent system of communications to reserve units all over Germany. Linking this asset to Tresco's resistance group in Army Group Center created a viable coup apparatus. In late 1942, Tresco and Albrecht formulated a plan to assassinate Hitler and stage a coup during Hitler's visit to the headquarters of Army Group Center at Smolensk in March 1943 by placing a bomb on his plane. The bomb did not go off, and a second attempt days later with Hitler at an exhibition of captured Soviet weaponry in Berlin also failed. These failures demoralized the conspirators. During 1943, they tried without success to recruit senior army field commanders, such as Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, to support a seizure of power. Whilst General Tresco was planning Hitler's assassination, Ludwig Beck was becoming a principal leader in the civilian resistance back in Berlin. Beck, upon his retirement from the military, joined up with other resistors in the civilian sector. They formed a resistance cell that included members from the churches, foreign service, intelligence agencies, and even members of the German Social Democratic and Communist parties. The Berlin resistors spent much of their time theorizing about the type of government that would replace National Socialism once Hitler's regime was toppled.
Since their political orientations range from the conservative to the left wing, the resistors did not always see eye to eye. In general, they seem to be aiming for a type of Christian socialism. There can be little doubt that many of the conspirators desired to save Germany. However, it would be unjust to interpret their patriotic sensibilities as being equitable with Nazi aims. The resistance was comprised of individuals with different concerns, but they did share one common agenda: the destruction of the Nazi regime.
Conspiratorial groups planning a coup of some kind had existed in the German army and the military intelligence organization since 1938. Early leaders of these plots included Brigadier General Hans Oster, head of the Military Intelligence Office, former Army Chief of Staff General Ludwig Beck, and Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben. Plans to stage a coup and prevent Hitler from launching a new world war were developed in 1938 and 1939, but were aborted because of the vacillations of Army Generals Franz Halder and Walter von Brauchitsch, and the failure of the Western powers to oppose Hitler's aggressions until 1939. The first military resistance group delayed their plans after Hitler's extreme popularity following the unexpectedly fast success in the Battle for France.
Here before us, on this table, lie the title deeds of 10 nations or states whose soil has been invaded and polluted, and whose men, women, and children lie prostrate or writhing under the Hitler yoke. A vile race of quislings, use a new word which will carry the scorn of mankind down the centuries, is hired to fawn upon the conqueror, to collaborate in his designs, and to enforce his rule upon their fellow countrymen, while groveling low themselves. Such is the plight of once glorious Europe, and such are the atrocities against which we are in arms. It is upon this foundation that Hitler, with his tattered lackey Mussolini at his tail, and Admiral Darlan frisking at his side, pretends to build out of hatred, appetite, and racial assertion a new order for Europe. Never did so mocking a fantasy obsess the mind of mortal man. We cannot tell what the course of this fell war will be as it spreads remorseless to ever wider regions. We know it will be hard. We expect it will be long. We cannot predict or measure its episodes or its tribulation. But one thing is certain. One thing is sure. One thing stands out stark and undeniable, massive and unassailable for all the world to see. It will not be by German hands that the structure will be rebuilt, or the union of the European family. In every country into which the German armies and the Nazi peace have broken, there has sprung up from the soil a hatred of the German name and a contempt for the Nazi creed, which the passage of hundreds of years will not efface from human memory. We cannot yet see how deliverance will come. Maybe it will come. But nothing is more certain than that every trace of Hitler's footstep, every stain of his infected and corroding fingers will be sponged and purged, and his head be blasted. That is the end.
Decisively against Germany. The army plotters and the civilian allies became convinced that Hitler must be assassinated so that a government acceptable to the Western allies could be formed and a separate peace negotiated in time to prevent a Soviet invasion of Germany and to avoid as much bloodshed as possible. In August 1943, Tresco met a young staff officer, Colonel Count Claus Philipp Schenk von Stauffenberg, for the first time.
I was born in Griefstein Castle in Upper Franconia on 15 November 1907, the youngest of 3 sons in a family in the Bavarian Catholic nobility. I grew up in a huge Renaissance-era style chateau that had been occupied by counts, dukes, and other governing nobles of the past.
While growing up, von Stauffenberg excelled at both sports and academics. He was excellent at horse riding and could speak fluently in Greek and Latin. Prior to joining the military in 1926, von Stauffenberg had considered careers in music and architecture.
In 1930, I met fellow Bavarian noble Nina von Lerchenfeld. 3 years later, we were wed, and the next year we had our first son.
In 1936, von Stauffenberg's excellence within the military earned him assignment to a position at the War Academy. He was advancing quickly through the ranks. While von Stauffenberg was a dedicated patriot and described by his family as preferring a monarchy to the constitution of the Weimar Republic, the German government set up after World War I, largely disliked by the German populace of the time, he remained largely neutral with regard to politics during Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party's rise to power. Von Stauffenberg wasn't directly opposed to the Nazi Party, yet began to doubt their tactics, and if they were any good for Germany. After vicious anti-Jewish events in 1938, such as the relocation of 17,000 Polish Jews into camps near the Polish border and the violence of Kristallnacht.
By September of 1939, von Stauffenberg had earned himself a strong reputation as an officer for his actions in the 6th Panzer Division during the German campaigns in Poland and France. Von Stauffenberg was transferred to the Army High Command in June the next year, just prior to the Battle of Dunkirk, and spent 18 months in Soviet territory as a part of Operation Barbarossa. It was there in conquered Soviet territory that von Stauffenberg saw firsthand the cruelty and utter disregard for human life that the Schutzstaffel was capable of. The events convinced von Stauffenberg that the Nazis had to be removed from power. In addition, the German defeat at Stalingrad further convinced von Stauffenberg that Hitler would lead Germany not to victory, but to destruction.
At Stalingrad, Hitler had refused to allow the German troops there to retreat or surrender, resulting in the loss of almost the entire German 6th Army, approximately 330,000 men. Their commander, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, finally disobeyed Hitler's orders and surrendered his remaining 90,000 battered, exhausted and starving troops to the USSR's General Georgy Zhukov. When news of the surrender reached Hitler, the Führer was outraged that his order had been disobeyed. After the German defeat at Stalingrad, von Stauffenberg requested a transfer to another front. The request was granted, and von Stauffenberg joined the 10th Panzer Division in Tunisia, just in time for the last few days of the Battle of the Kasserine Pass.
Later, on 7 April 1943, the car I was riding in drove into a minefield. I was nearly killed, in the process losing my left eye, right hand, and 2 fingers on my left hand. I also suffered serious damage to my left ear and knee. Surprisingly, I not only survived the incident, but managed to keep my eyesight in the one remaining eye.
While recovering in a military hospital in Munich for the next few months, von Stauffenberg had managed to contact several members of the German resistance, attempting to remove the Nazis from power. By September of 1943, von Stauffenberg had returned to active duty in Berlin. He had been promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel and acted as the chief of staff to General Friedrich Albrecht, a fellow member of the German resistance. Von Stauffenberg insisted that the cabinet of the post-Nazi government he and his fellow conspirators would institute, if they were successful, would be strictly anti-Nazi. Had the resistance been successful, von Stauffenberg would likely have been appointed the state secretary in the war ministry.
Despite this, von Stauffenberg was not popular amongst all the members of the resistance. Fellow conspirator Dr. Karl Goerdeler called von Stauffenberg a cranky, obstinate fellow who wanted to play politics and who wanted to steer a dubious political course with the left-wing socialists and communists, and gave me a bad time with his overwhelming egotism. Nevertheless, even Dr. Goerdeler still held great respect for von Stauffenberg. This is not to imply that the entire resistance felt this way. Resistance sympathizer Franz Halder describes von Stauffenberg as a born leader, one whose whole outlook on life was rooted in his sense of responsibility towards God, who was not prepared to be satisfied with theoretical explanations and discussions, but who was burning to act. In 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, perhaps the most famous member of the German military, let the resistance know that he had no like of Hitler nor the Nazis and would follow the orders of an anti-Nazi government if it were able to seize power. Von Stauffenberg and others in the resistance had doubts about Rommel's sincerity, thinking he was likely a Nazi supporter who was merely interested in switching sides now that the war wasn't going so well for Germany anymore. Rommel also expressed the opinion that if Hitler were killed, he would become a martyr for the Nazis to rally behind and used to convince even more people to follow them. Instead of Hitler being assassinated, Rommel proposed he be captured and convicted in a court of his crimes to weaken his position as a great leader before the German people. While this was happening, Rommel proposed a peace treaty with the Western Allies would be drawn up and the war would continue against the Soviets.
We disagreed with Rommel on this point, for we believed that peace with the West could not be achieved so easily, especially with Hitler still alive, and that to succeed, Hitler and 2 other top Nazis who could replace him, possibly with the same level of madness, Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, would have to be killed. We also believed that we would be unable to negotiate peace with the Allies whilst Hitler was still alive.
US President Franklin Roosevelt had announced that the Allies would accept nothing short of the unconditional surrender of not merely the Nazis, but Germany altogether. Earlier in the Nazis' reign, the German resistance and American and British intelligence agents sympathetic to their cause were unable to convince the American and British governments to take the German resistance seriously. In fact, 2 British intelligence agents were captured by the Nazis prior to the start of all-out war between Germany and Britain, when they were meeting with Nazi agents in the guise of German resistance. The British blamed the German resistance, despite that they had never actually been in contact with them. Eventually, Great Britain established a policy of absolute silence with Germany in regard to communication. Even after the war, and to this day, the acts of the German resistance against the Nazis remains largely unknown.
It was around this time that Albrecht put forward to Treschow and Stauffenberg a new strategy for staging a coup against Hitler. The Reserve Army had an operational plan called Operation Valkyrie, which was to be used in the event that the disruption caused by the Allied bombing of German cities caused a breakdown in law and order, or a rising of some millions of slave laborers from occupied countries now being used in German factories. Ulbricht had suggested that this plan could be used to mobilize the reserve army to take control of the German cities, disarm the SS, and arrest the Nazi leadership once Hitler had been assassinated. Operation Valkyrie could only be put into effect by General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the reserve army, so he must either be won over to the conspiracy or in some way neutralized, if the plan was to succeed.
Fromm, like many senior officers, knew in general about the military conspiracies against Hitler, but neither supported them nor reported them to the Gestapo. During late 1943 and early 1944, there were at least 4 failed attempts to get one of the military conspirators near enough to Hitler for long enough to kill him with hand grenades, bombs, or a revolver. But this task was becoming increasingly difficult.
We have victory. A remarkable and definite victory. A bright gleam has caught the helmets of our soldiers and warmed and cheered all our hearts. The late Monsieur Venizelos observed that in all our wars, England, you ought to have said Britain, of course, England always wins one battle, the last. We seem to have begun rather earlier this time. General Alexander with his brilliant comrade and lieutenant, General Montgomery, had gained a glorious and decisive victory in what I think should be called the Battle of Egypt. Rommel's army has been defeated. It has been routed. It has been very largely destroyed as a fighting force. The Italians were left to perish in the waterless desert or surrender, as they are doing by tens of thousands. Germans have received back again that measure of fire and steel which they have so often meted out to others. Ah, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
As the war situation deteriorated, Hitler no longer appeared in public and rarely visited Berlin. He spent most of his time at his headquarters at the Wolfschanze, Wolf's Lair, near Rastenburg in East Prussia, with occasional breaks at his Bavarian mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. In both places, he was heavily guarded and rarely saw people he did not already know and trust. Himmler and the Gestapo were increasingly suspicious of plots against Hitler and specifically suspected the officers of the General Staff, which was indeed the place where most of the young officers willing to sacrifice themselves to kill Hitler were located.
The hour of our greatest effort and action is approaching. We march with valiant allies who count on us as we count on them. The flashing eyes of all our soldiers, sailors and airmen must be fixed upon the enemy on their front. The only homeward road for all of us lies through the arch of victory. The magnificent armies of the United States are here or are pouring in. Our own troops, the best trained and best equipped we have ever had, stand at their side in equal numbers and in true comradeship. And when the signal is given, the whole circle of avenging nations will hurl themselves upon the foe and batter out the life of the cruelest tyranny which has ever sought to bar the progress of mankind.
When the Western Allies successfully landed at Normandy and began closing in on Berlin, as were the Soviets from the east, one of Tresco's aides, Lieutenant Heinrich Graf von Lendorf-Steinort, wrote to Stauffenberg, "The assassination must be attempted, whatever the cost. Even if it fails, we must take action in Berlin, for the practical purpose no longer matters. What matters now is that the German resistance movement must take the plunge before the eyes of the world and of history. Compared to that, nothing else matters."
We decided that action should be taken as soon as possible. Along with my fellow conspirators, we had considered aborting the coup attempt altogether, as it became clearer and clearer that the end of the war and Germany's defeat was inevitable. We came to the conclusion, however, that we must at least try to prevent further senseless loss of life and show the world that all of Germany did not sit idly by whilst this brutal Nazi regime slaughtered millions. Plans were accelerated, which caused some fatal slip-ups for the resistance, not only because of the approaching Allied troops, but also the merger between the SS and Military Intelligence Division, led by and containing a large number of the resistance. This had put the entire resistance movement in danger, as the SS was uncovering more and more evidence of a resistance against the Nazis and who specifically was involved day by day. Time was running out.
By July of 1944, von Stauffenberg had been promoted to a full colonel, which gave him frequent personal contact with Hitler. Von Stauffenberg practiced setting off a time bomb with his only 3 remaining fingers and decided it would be him that killed Adolf Hitler.
The problem was that von Stauffenberg, a devout Christian, was religious, and he didn't want to kill or injure others in his assassination of Hitler. As a result of his injuries, he would be unable to simply shoot Hitler at point-blank range. Furthermore, although it would kill Hitler, it would undoubtedly also result in Hitler's personal guard killing von Stauffenberg. As part of the plan, von Stauffenberg would be needed after the assassination to direct the coup d'etat in Berlin, as resistance control troops seized control of the government.
On the 15th of July 1944, Colonel von Stauffenberg and his time bomb attended a meeting with Hitler at Rastenburg. Neither Himmler nor Goering were there, but it was agreed that von Stauffenberg would attempt to kill Hitler with the bomb regardless. Time was running out, and something needed to be done. Informing his compatriots that he would proceed ahead and blow up Hitler, von Stauffenberg got off the phone and returned to the conference room, only to find that the meeting had ended early and Hitler had already left. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, General Albrecht, not knowing that the opportunity to kill Hitler had passed unseized, sent into effect the first phase of Operation Valkyrie, seizing control of government buildings throughout Berlin.
Von Stauffenberg had rushed to inform Albrecht to abort Operation Valkyrie. Albrecht immediately shut down the operation before his superiors discovered what had happened. To ensure this was done, General Albrecht drove from one building to another in Berlin, giving the order to stand down personally. General Albrecht luckily managed to convince his superior officers that the premature execution of Operation Valkyrie was merely a dress rehearsal in the case of a real uprising against the Nazi regime ever occurring. While this did prevent the general and others from being revealed as resistance members, Albrecht's explanation also meant that the next time Operation Valkyrie was executed, it would have to be for real.
On the 18th of July 1944, Dr. Karl Gödler, a key member of the resistance, was arrested by the Gestapo. Colonel von Stauffenberg had taken care to shroud the conspiracy in as much secrecy as possible. Few people within the resistance knew about the assassination plots, and the truth of Operation Valkyrie. Fewer still knew the specifics of such things, ensuring that if one member of the resistance were captured, the plans for the coup could continue. Also on this day, Colonel von Stauffenberg received orders to meet with Hitler at his Wolfslayer headquarters to brief the Führer on reports from the Eastern Front. Von Stauffenberg told his co-conspirators that the 20th of July would be the resistance's last chance and to be ready.
On the night of 19 July 1944, I stopped to pray at the church, then stayed at my brother's house for the night, finalizing the details of our plan. I managed to get 4 hours sleep. The next day, myself and Lieutenant Werner von Heften headed for Wolfslayer whilst in Berlin. General Ludwig Beck was awaiting news of Hitler's death before announcing to the world that Hitler had been killed by a power-hungry Nazi elite and that the army had seized control from the Nazis, instituting martial law and attempting to start talks with the Allies for a ceasefire. In order to ensure Hitler's death, I was carrying 2 time bombs in my briefcase instead of 1 and was planning to activate both to detonate at the same time. Lieutenant von Heften, because of his lower rank, was not allowed to attend the actual meeting with Hitler, but did stay with me as much as he could whilst at Wolf's Lair. After meeting with Hitler and briefing him on what was involved in moving troops along the Eastern Front, I excused myself. Then, with von Heften, I entered the changing room where we began arming the bombs with special pliers made for use with my 3 fingers. Despite these specially crafted pliers, the bombs were extremely difficult to arm, and an aide sent to bring me back to the meeting managed to catch a glimpse of myself and von Heften fiddling with this mysterious package. Fearing Hitler would be alerted and having time to arm only 1 of the bombs, I returned to the meeting. Several minutes before the bomb was to go off, I excused myself to make an emergency phone call. As soon as no one was watching, I left the building.
Whilst von Stauffenberg was making his escape, unbeknown to him and by chance, one of the officers in the meeting with Hitler moves the briefcase that had been planted next to Hitler to the other side of the huge table a war map was laid out upon, in order to get a better view of the map from his position. Had this not happened, or had both bombs been armed, Hitler would have been killed.
At 12:42 p.m., the bomb detonated. Colonel von Stauffenberg witnessed the explosion and several bodies flying out of the already open windows of the building from a few hundred yards away. Sure that everyone within the building was dead or dying, von Stauffenberg left the Wolf's Lair and began a 3-hour flight back to Berlin. Unfortunately, back in Berlin, the resistance members there had no idea whether or not the assassination attempt was successful. And because launching Operation Valkyrie again in the event that the bomb had not been detonated would mean the end of them, they awaited word from von Stauffenberg. Once von Stauffenberg arrived, there was a rush to put the plan in motion. Not all government buildings could be taken control of at that point. In particular, the resistance couldn't take control of the Nazis' communications headquarters. The propaganda ministry on the Wilhelmstrasse with Joseph Goebbels inside was surrounded by troops. But Goebbels' phone was not cut off, another fatal error. The decisive moment came at 7 p.m. when Hitler was sufficiently recovered to make phone calls. He was able to phone Goebbels at the propaganda ministry. Goebbels arranged for Hitler to speak to the commander of the troops surrounding the ministry, Major Otto Rehmer, and assure him that he was still alive. Hitler ordered Rehmer to regain control of the situation in Berlin. At 8 p.m., a furious Witzleben arrived at the Bendler block and had a bitter argument with Stauffenberg, who was still insisting that the coup could go ahead. Witzleben left shortly afterwards. At around this time, the planned seizure of power in Paris was aborted when Kluger, who had recently been appointed commander-in-chief in the West, learned that Hitler was alive, changed sides with alacrity, and had Stulpnagel arrested. At 9 p.m., there was an announcement that Hitler would deliver a speech to Germany in a short time. Von Stauffenberg and his associates were shocked. Hitler had obviously survived the blast. A falling support beam had injured Hitler, and his right arm was temporarily paralyzed. Hitler's eardrums had also been punctured, and he suffered some burns, but overall had escaped any serious injury. The group stayed holed up in the War Ministry. The less resolute members of the conspiracy in Berlin also now began to change sides. Fighting broke out in the Bendler block between officers supporting and opposing the coup, and Stauffenberg was wounded. Around 11 p.m., a group of Nazis had managed to break into the ministry and take the resistance members there captive. General Friedrich Fromm, who had previously been willing to work for the new post-Nazi government had the resistance been successful, had regained control, hoping by a show of zealous loyalty to save his own skin. Beck, realizing the game was up, shot himself, the first of many suicides in the coming days.
Fromm declared that he had convened a court-martial consisting of himself and had sentenced Albrecht, Stauffenberg, Heften, and another officer, Albrecht Merz from Quenheim, to death. At 10 past midnight on the 21st of July, they were shot in the courtyard outside, possibly to prevent them from revealing Fromm's involvement. Just prior to his death, Claus von Stauffenberg was said to have shouted, "Long live our sacred Germany." Others would have been executed as well, but at midnight the SS, led by Otto Skorzeny, arrived on the scene, and further executions were forbidden.
Fromm went off to see Goebbels to claim credit for suppressing the coup. He was immediately arrested, and later he too would be executed. Some have speculated that if Stauffenberg had placed the briefcase in a slightly different location, the bomb might have had the intended effect on the primary target, since the bomb was supposedly placed behind a very thick leg of the heavy oak conference table. The leg apparently deflected the blast and prevented the force from reaching Hitler.
This thesis is supported by the fact that others seated in less fortunate positions were killed or more seriously injured than Hitler. There is also a speculation that had Stauffenberg left the second bomb in his briefcase, even without arming it, the detonation of the first bomb could have triggered the explosion of the second bomb, and the combined force of the two bombs going off nearly simultaneously might have killed Hitler. An alternate analysis is that the single bomb might have been effective had the meeting been held as originally planned in Hitler's reinforced and subterranean bunker, instead of the wooden hut that doubled as Speer's barracks and makeshift briefing room. Over the coming weeks, Himmler's Gestapo, driven by a furious Hitler, rounded up nearly everyone who had the remotest connection with the July 20 plot. The discovery of letters and diaries in the homes and offices of those arrested revealed the plots of 1938, 1939 and 1943, and this led to further rounds of arrests, including that of Franz Halder, who finished the war in a concentration camp. Under Himmler's new Sippenhaft, blood guilt laws, all the relatives of the principal plotters were also arrested. Eventually, some 7,000 people were arrested and hundreds were executed, not all of them connected with the July 20 plot, since the Gestapo used the occasion to settle scores with many other people suspected of opposition sympathies. Very few of the plotters tried to escape or to deny their guilt when arrested. Those who survived interrogation were given perfunctory trial before the People's Court and its judge, Roland Freisler. The first trials were held on the 7th and 8th of August 1944.
Hitler had ordered that the most prominent conspirators of those found guilty be hung like cattle. The treatment that had been dealt out to those executed as a result of the Roter-Kapelle was that of slow strangulation, using suspension from a rope attached to a slaughterhouse meat hook. For the July 20 plotters, piano wire was used instead of rope.
Many people took their own lives prior to either their trial or their execution, including Tresco, Kluge, and Erwin Rommel, who was accused of having knowledge of the plot beforehand and not revealing it to Hitler. He was given the option of suicide via cyanide or a public trial by Freisler's People's Court. If he committed suicide, his family wouldn't be subjected to a reprisal. However, with the verdict a foregone conclusion, the People's Court was basically a kangaroo court. If Rommel stood trial, there would have been no chance of successfully defending himself, and his family and staff would have been executed along with him. Rommel committed suicide on October the 14th, 1944. Stulpnagel also tried to commit suicide but survived and was subsequently hanged. Fromm's attempt to win favour by executing Stauffenberg and others on the night of July the 20th had merely exposed his own previous lack of action and apparent failure to report the plot. Having been arrested on July the 21st, Fromm was later convicted and sentenced to death by the People's Court. Hitler personally commuted his death sentence from hanging to a more honourable firing squad. Executions continued down to the last days of the war. Hitler took his survival to be a divine moment in history, and as such, commissioned a special decoration to be made. The resulting decoration was the Wound Badge of the 20th of July 1944, which Hitler awarded to those who were in the conference room at the time. This badge was one of the rarest decorations awarded by Nazi Germany.